This is Audible.
Tantor Audio presents The Sea Wolves, A History of the Vikings by Lars Brownworth, narrated by Joe Barrett. On Romans, Holy Romans, and Byzantines. Clarity about the past is often sought by oversimplifying it. History is broken down into digestible chunks with neat borders and labels which, however useful, can sometimes be misleading. Dates which were hardly noticed at the time become watershed years, and epochs and ages are given names which would have been unrecognizable to those living during them. When national or imperial pride gets involved, the resulting propaganda usually muddies the water even further. The Middle Ages had two rival empires, both claiming to be the true Roman Empire. For most of their history, neither of them actually controlled Rome, yet both had claims on its legacy. The confusion stems from the 3rd century A.D., when the Roman Emperor Diocletian decided to split the old Roman Empire in half. The western half, with its capital in Italy, collapsed in the 5th century. The traditional date is 476. But the eastern portion survived until 1453, when a Turkish invasion and the guns of the modern world finally brought it down. Since the eastern half was centered on Constantinople, the old Greek city of Byzantium, modern-day Istanbul, modern historians refer to it as the Byzantine Empire, or simply Byzantium. Its location in the thoroughly Hellenized East meant that Greek became the preferred language, so Byzantium is sometimes referred to as the Greek Empire. Nonetheless, it is important to note that while it existed, both friends and enemies alike viewed it as Roman, and drew no artificial distinctions between the Empire of Rome and that of Byzantium. The medieval competitor to the Byzantine Empire arrived on Christmas Day in the year 800. During a Mass in Rome, Pope Leo III, for political reasons of his own, placed a crown on the Frankish king Charlemagne's head and named him Imperator Romanorum, announcing that the defunct Western Empire had been reborn. This version of the empire, however, which spanned both French and Germanic lands, was based in present-day Germany and never completely controlled Italy. Because of this, and in an attempt to simplify a complex series of events, most historians refer to Charlemagne's coronation anachronistically as the start of the Holy Roman Empire, or the German Empire. Politically, Charlemagne's state fell apart almost immediately, and when his direct line petered out in less than a century, the title of Roman Emperor soon followed it. In 962, the German Otto I, a distant relative of Charlemagne, revived the title, and in 1157 his successor, Frederick Barbarossa, officially added the term sacrum, holy, to his title. Introduction. The Hammer of the North. Wake early if you want another man's life or land. No land for the lazy wolf. No battles won in bed. Edda of Saemund the Wise, a collection of the sayings of Odin. Just off the west coast of present-day Scotland lies the small island of Iona, a grassy promontory with white sandy beaches rising up out of the North Sea. Today it is a place of quiet contemplation, relatively undisturbed by the tour groups or visiting schoolchildren wandering among its enchanted ruins. Even for those who know, it is easy to forget that 12 centuries ago these idyllic shores were the scenes of unimaginable violence. The monastery of Iona is the symbolic heart of Scottish Christianity, one of the oldest and most important religious centers in Western Europe. It was founded by the Irish monk Columba in the 6th century and became the focal point for the spread of the faith throughout Scotland. In the early centuries, the monks came to seek seclusion among the desert of the Atlantic Ocean and built simple beehive-shaped stone huts where they could concentrate on their prayers and vows of poverty and obedience. Over time, however, the small community became a major pilgrimage site and a great medieval center of learning. It developed into a training school for monks with special rooms for the copying of manuscripts called scriptoriums that produced works of art famous throughout Europe. Chief among these was the Book of Kells, an illuminated collection of the four Gospels that was described by its Irish contemporaries as the most precious object in the Western world. In addition to its religious treasures, Iona also boasted an unrivaled collection of royal tombs. Most of the early Scottish kings, including the two made famous by Shakespeare, Macbeth and his victim Duncan, were interred in the monastery's crypt. For centuries, the island was an oasis of peace, protected by the faith of its inhabitants and the vast ocean surrounding it. In 794, however, a ripple of fear penetrated the tranquility. Rumors reached the monks of terrible raids to the east, sister monasteries devastated by strange northern pagans. Early the next year, while the monks were celebrating a holy day, ships with prows carved to resemble serpents and dragons slipped onto the beach below the main abbey. Leaping onto the white sand of a shoreline, which would later bear the name Martyrs' Bay in memory of the slain, the raiders headed for the buildings, cutting down the monks they found along the way. Smashing open the doors, they killed anyone who tried to resist, drenching the stone floors of the chapel with blood. Anything that looked valuable was seized, including rich vestments which were ripped off of the bodies of the dead or dying. As the surviving monks fled in all directions, the attackers set fire to the great abbey and then raced onto the beach with their considerable loot. Seemingly in the blink of an eye, they were gone. Left behind were bloody corpses, burning buildings, and a shattered community. Virtually the only thing left intact was the High Cross of St. Martin's, one of a dozen or so large carved monoliths that dotted the landscape. In the side facing away from the devastated church was carved the biblical figure of Abraham, with his sword raised high, as if in warning of the terrible events that had just unfolded. The raids on the British Isles were only the beginning of a great hammer blow that fell on an unprepared Europe. The broken bodies and the blackened shells of buildings in places like Iona would be all too common in the centuries to come. The suddenness of the violence left many occupants of Europe disoriented and anxious. The shock and despair can still be felt in the words of Alcuin, an Anglo-Saxon monk writing from Charlemagne's imperial capital of Aachen after one of the first raids. Never before in Britain has such a terror appeared as this we have now suffered at the hands of the heathen. The fact that the word Viking still conjures up that image of blonde-haired barbarians leaping off of dragon ships to plunder a monastery is a testament to the trauma inflicted on Western Christendom during the 300 years of the Viking Age. It is burned into our collective memory. There is, even now, something alien about those northern warriors. The origin of the word Viking itself is unknown. Contemporary 9th century records call the raiders Northmen, Danes, Norse, or Heathen. The Anglo-Saxons, frequent targets of their attacks, did have a word, Viking, which meant sea raider, but it first appears only in the 11th century. A better explanation comes from the Vikings themselves. In Old Norse, Vik meant inlet or bay, and the Vik district near the Oslo fjord was a main source of iron used in sword production. The word Viking probably started off as a reference to the men from the Vik district, and gradually came to include all Scandinavian raiders. Endless speculation has centered on the question of why the Vikings suddenly erupted from their lands in the 8th century. Theories have ranged from overpopulation and political pressure to climate change and technological innovations. What is clear, however, is that there was a cyclical nature to the great waves of northern Europeans leaving their homes. The first recorded migration of Scandinavian people actually predates the Viking Age by nearly 5 centuries. As the Western Roman Empire tottered toward its final collapse, the Goths, a people originating from what is now southern Sweden, invaded the empire, eventually settling in southern France and Spain. But the Goths wouldn't have recognized themselves as Scandinavian or Viking any more than the raiders of the 8th century would have. Although they had a common language, the Vikings were never a single people, and most of those who lived in Scandinavia during the Viking Age never left home. The raiders were a somewhat suspect minority with multiple reasons for adventuring. Single explanations, therefore, are bound to be incomplete. Further complicating matters is the fact that the Viking story has largely been told by others. Histories compiled by their victims, references in the annals of the older, more civilized nations to the south and east, and the tantalizing glimpses that archaeology gives us. The Vikings vanished, partly because their artists worked in wood. Summers were spent felling trees, which turned into the feasting halls, ships, and later stave churches that made up their civilization. Of these, only the last remain more or less intact, and they represent the twilight of the Viking world. The Vikings themselves wrote very little down. Their runic alphabet was more suited to magical spells and marker stones than epics or histories. By the time the great Icelandic bard Snorri Sturluson composed his Heimskringla, the Lives of the Norse Kings, more than 4 centuries had passed since the Viking Age had ended. But those stories reflect a much older oral tradition, and they allow us to hear the spirit, if not the exact words, of the tales that Viking poets told to pass the long northern nights. They illustrate the Viking mindset in the same way that the Iliad illuminates that of the ancient Greeks. A true warrior went out, gained riches, built great halls, and handsomely rewarded his loyal followers. Glory, and kingships, could only be won on the battlefield. Fired by this mindset, young Viking men sailed out to the glittering lands to the south and east of Scandinavia to win everlasting fame. A measure of their success can be found in the anxious prayers that soon echoed from European churches. The Abbey of St. Vaast, on the northern coast of France, included in its daily chants the phrase, "Deliver us, God, from the savage race of Northmen which lays waste our realms." It was a sentiment that many would soon share, from Constantinople in the east to the Americas in the west. Prologue. The Viking Dawn. A sword age, a wind age, a wolf age. No longer is there mercy among men. Philispa, Doomsday Prophecy from Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda. The holy island of Lindisfarne is an unlikely place to begin the story of an epic of violence and blood. If anything, it seems today like a place outside of time, an inconspicuous and unimpressive bit of land sticking out of the North Sea. Covered by sparse vegetation, its rocky soil slopes gently towards the tidal coasts, unencumbered by much protection from either the northern climate or the pounding of the waves. As early as the 6th century, the island had become home to a small enclave of monks who were looking for a spiritual haven, a place where they could retreat from the world and its distractions. Within a century, a priory had been built on the island's southern promontory, and its suitability for quiet prayer had attracted a monk named Cuthbert, Northumbria's future patron saint. Renowned in life for his personal warmth and holiness, Cuthbert spent 23 years on the island, and his tomb, thanks to numerous miracles attributed to him after his death, became a popular place for pilgrimage among England's Anglo-Saxon population. No other monastery better symbolized the new confidence of the late 8th century. Thanks to a series of strong rulers in both Britain and the continent, a measure of security had returned to Western Europe that hadn't been seen since the Pax Romana. The crumbling relics of a more prosperous time lay on all sides, but farmers, craftsmen, and monks had settled into the sure, steady rhythms of early medieval life. Politically, England was divided among 7 kingdoms, 4 major and 3 minor ones. The most powerful of the major kingdoms was Mercia, which controlled nearly the entire central portion of the island, from the Welsh border to the North Sea. The other major kingdoms were Northumbria, stretching from Edinburgh to the Humber River in the northeast, East Anglia, a swampy area along England's east coast, and Wessex, which covered all of southwestern England, including Cornwall. The 3 petty kingdoms were Sussex on the Channel coast, Essex, which controlled London, and Kent, the area around Canterbury. Although all of England had been prospering in the 8th century, the northern regions in particular experienced a cultural flowering that was impressive enough to be remembered by historians as the Northumbrian Renaissance, 6 centuries before the more famous Italian one. Painting, metalwork, sculpture, and architecture all flourished, and it was during this time that the great Anglo-Saxon illuminated manuscripts were produced, among them the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Book of Kells, and the Book of Durrow. Throughout England, religious houses opened up schools that produced academics of such quality that when Charlemagne decided to sponsor his own school, the Palatine Academy, he staffed it with English scholars. Monasteries like those at Jarrow, Lindisfarne, and Iona, on the northern coasts of England and Scotland, were the main beneficiaries of this artistic flowering. Gospel books with lavish covers and gilded pages appeared along with reliquaries studded with precious stones, bishops' croziers, their symbol of office, made of delicate ivory, and vestments inlaid with gold and silver. The 8th century, which had overseen this Renaissance, seemed poised to end on a note of increased prosperity and harmony. In 787, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reported that the farmers of England worked their fields in supreme tranquility. The contentment was such that one chronicler was carried away enough to write that even the burden-bearing frame of the oxen placed their necks under the yoke in dearest love. The shadow of things to come, however, was revealed that autumn, when a lookout spotted 3 unidentified ships off the coast of the Isle of Portland in southern Wessex. Whenever ships were spotted, whether hostile or friendly, it was the duty of the Coast Guard to inform the King's Reeve, the chief magistrate of a district or town. The Isle of Portland's Reeve, a man named Bodaherd, must have assumed the strangers were merchants, and probably rowed down to the beach to direct them to a manor where they would be able to obtain the necessary permissions to conduct business. However, we don't know what he actually planned, because before he had a chance to open his mouth, they loosed a volley of arrows, killing him and his men instantly. Poor Bodaherd had the misfortune of making Europe's first recorded contact with the Vikings, and his family didn't even have the satisfaction of punishing his killers. By the time the King's men arrived, the Vikings would have been long gone, sailing further along the coast or back home with whatever they had managed to snatch off the corpses. There was nothing to be done but bury the bodies and hope the strangers didn't return. News of the attack spread quickly, and nervous local populations began to take defensive measures in case the raiders reappeared. On both sides of the English Channel, farmers were recruited to serve in peasant levies, assemblies of local shock troops who could be called into service quickly. Some religious houses took similar precautions. In 792, the monasteries of Kent were required to contribute to raising coastal defenses against pagan seamen. The Vikings, however, were not simple pirates, and soon revealed the English preparations to be hopelessly inadequate. Their previous raids had merely been probing attacks, intelligence gathering to test both the prize and the defenses. In 793, they struck in force. Their target was not, as might be expected, one of the rich trading centers such as could be found at Dorset or Southampton. These were well guarded and in proximity to large populations which could rally to their defense. Instead, the cunning Vikings chose the monastery of Lindisfarne, isolated, prosperous, and guarded only by the prayers of unsuspecting monks. Over the past century, English monasteries had grown fantastically wealthy, a fact which spread to the Viking homelands either through word of mouth or through trading activity. Monasteries were natural sites for the sale of imported goods, wines for communion, high-quality textiles for church vestments, and precious metals for plate and reliquaries. In addition to the fortunes accumulated through gifts by pious donors, they also acted as proto-banks, since local magnates frequently used major churches as safe deposits for their own portable wealth. Raiding a monastery was the Viking equivalent of winning the lottery. Best of all, as far as the Vikings were concerned, these rich targets were virtually unguarded. All over Europe, religious houses had been built in exposed coastal areas in the belief that the sea would protect their flank, an opinion that was now proved terribly wrong. The shock of that discovery can still be felt in the writings of the time. "It was not thought possible," wrote one cleric after the first attack, "that such an inroad from the sea could be made." Lindisfarne was wealthy even by monastic standards, and its selection as the Vikings' first target was no accident. It had been personally endowed by the Northumbrian king, and possessed a peerless collection of relics, including the sainted remains of the English monk Cuthbert and the equally famous Irish missionary Columba, who had brought Christianity to Scotland. The lucrative pilgrim trade, which had grown from the fame of these two alone, had made the monastery fabulously rich. Various Viking groups had been active in the area for some time, and on June 8, 793, one of these groups, from what is today Norway, carried out a brutally efficient attack. An anonymous Northumbrian monk recorded the event. "The pagans from the northern regions came with a naval force to Britain, like stinging hornets, and spread on all sides like fearful wolves, robbed, tore, and slaughtered." No one was spared. Monks who tried to resist were hacked apart or dragged onto the beach and drowned. Reliquaries were pulled into pieces, and their contents dumped on the ground. Rich tapestries adorning chapel walls were torn down, altars were smashed, and everywhere the corpses of the slain lay like dung in the streets. The disaster sent a shockwave through Europe. If the heart of English Christianity could fall, then surely no one was safe. Anxious monks trying to make sense of the calamity claimed that there had been divine warning signs before the attack. Sheets of lightning had been spotted in the skies several weeks before, supposedly accompanied by fiery dragons wheeling menacingly above the priory. The disaster was widely attributed to the moral laxity of the English Church. A few weeks after the raid, a letter was circulated quoting Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 14. "Then the Lord said unto me, Out of the north an evil shall break forth upon all the inhabitants of the land," and calls for reform were made. The scholar Alcuin, writing to the Bishop of Lindisfarne with eerie clarity, identified both the cause and the proper response. "Either this is the beginning of a greater tribulation, or else the sins of the inhabitants have called it upon themselves. Truly, it has not happened by chance. You who are left, stand mindfully, fight bravely, defend the camp of God." No amount of soul-searching, however, stemmed the tide. The next year, the monasteries of Jarrow on the east coast and the Isle of Skye on the west were hit, and in 795 Iona Abbey was looted. Almost the entire community, monks, nuns, peasants, and animals, were dragged down to the seashore and slaughtered. It was a grim portent of the carnage to come. Alcuin, writing from the safety of Charlemagne's capital, captured the anguish. "What assurance is there for the churches of Britain if St. Cuthbert, with so great a number of saints, defends not his own?" The Raiders. Chapter 1. The Vikings at Home. One's home is best, small though it may be. Edda of Saemund the Wise. The most frightening thing about the Vikings was that almost nothing about them was known. In the 8th century, their homelands were at the fringe of the known world, a cold and inhospitable place that the civilizing hand of the Roman Empire had never touched. Scandinavia, the land divided today into the modern countries of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, is a place of extremes. It stretches 1,243 miles from Jutland in the south to Nivskjellodden in the Arctic Circle, a distance accounting for half the length of Europe. It contains one of the continent's most mountainous countries, Norway, as well as one of its flattest, Denmark, whose highest point rises only 561 feet above sea level. Of the three countries, none of which existed at the start of the Viking Age, Denmark, covering the Jutland Peninsula and more than 500 small islands, has the most favorable climate. Warmed by the Gulf Stream and the North Atlantic Current, the country is a patchwork of rocky beaches, green fields, and forests of oak and elm. Since it shares its western coast with modern Germany, West was a natural direction for its young men to explore. Vikings from Denmark fanned out across the Low Countries and France, eventually crossing the Channel into Britain, and from there conducting raids as far as Spain and even Italy. Although England was first attacked by raiders from what is now Norway, so many Danes infested their waterways that the Anglo-Saxon sources took to referring to all Vikings as Danes, regardless of where they came from. The main Scandinavian peninsula, covered today by the modern countries of Norway and Sweden, has a much less hospitable climate than Denmark. Of the two regions, what is now Sweden has the better farmland. Its shores look east towards Russia, and most of its Vikings traveled in that direction, although largely to trade instead of raid. Their exploits are arguably the least well known, but some of the most lasting, since they founded the first Russian state in Kiev. The most rugged of the Viking lands is Norway, almost a third of which is above the Arctic Circle. The long western coast is protected from the icy battering of the Atlantic by a barrier of rocky islands and dramatic fjords, which provide the Northern Way, a navigable coastal route to the Arctic Circle that gave Norway its name. Unsurprisingly, when they ventured into the North Sea, the Norwegian Vikings pushed west, sometimes raiding and sometimes colonizing. The group founded settlements in Greenland and reached the New World around AD 1000. In the Viking Age, both Sweden and Norway were thinly settled and largely unable to sustain large populations. Norway's available farmland was broken up by long, narrow fjords which led into the mountainous interior, while vast, impenetrable forests, bogs, and lakes closed off much of southern and western Sweden. A surprising amount of game was available in the summers, including reindeer, elk, wolves, bears, wolverines, and foxes. But the long winters punished those who failed to plan ahead. Perhaps because of this scarcity, hospitality was highly valued, and failure as a host could start blood feuds lasting generations. To pass the time, they invented a number of games, including Lake, a ball game similar to hockey, which attracted both large crowds and frequent injuries. Several less violent board games did exist, but the Vikings primarily valued physical fitness. Their most popular activities were usually tests of strength, wrestling, sword fighting, and trying to dunk each other, endurance, climbing fjords, skiing, skating, and distance swimming, or agility, throwing spears with both hands at the same time, or leaping from oar to oar outside the railing of a ship while it was being rowed. Winners of these contests were not shy in broadcasting the fact. A Norwegian king named Odin boasted to his brother and co-ruler Sigurd, "I was so good at skating that I didn't know anyone who could vie with me, but you weren't better than a cow." When not fighting themselves, the Scandinavians would occasionally pit animals against each other. The most popular of these blood sports involved horses. Two stallions would be led in sight and smell of a fenced-off mare and allowed to fight, often resulting in the death of the weaker one. Indiscriminate killing was frowned upon, but mercy was not a quality that befitted a warrior. One Icelandic man was apparently mocked as a child lover because he refused to participate in the sport of tossing captured babies into the air and catching them on the point of a spear. These pursuits sound brutal to our ears, but in other ways the Vikings were surprisingly modern. Unlike the usual stereotype of a rude barbarian, they were very conscious of their appearance and had excellent hygiene. They carefully groomed themselves and generally bathed at least once a day with a lye-rich soap that both bleached their hair and cut down on lice. Highly prized tweezers, razors, combs, and even ear cleaners have all been found in Viking excavations. Thanks to the absence of sugar in European diets, cavities were virtually unknown, and although half of their children died before age 10, those who survived could expect to live into their 50s, a very respectable age for the time. The average height for males was 5'8", and females 5'3", not towering, but certainly taller than the peoples to the south with whom they came in contact. Women, although by no means equal, probably had greater rights in Viking culture than anywhere in Western Christendom. Many girls married as young as 12, but when the husband was away, the wife ran every aspect of the home and made all important decisions. If she remained married for 20 years, and either partner could dissolve the union at will, she had a legal right to half of the wealth her husband had accumulated. Unlike in the rest of Europe, she could inherit property, divorce her husband, and reclaim her dowry when the marriage ended. Several touching runestones have been found raised in women's honor, from the Danish king Gorm the Old, who praised his wife as the ornament of Denmark, to an anonymous carving proclaiming that there was no better housewife than Hasmaira. Children were encouraged to help their parents with the running of the household. Girls were taught the arts of brewing and dairy production, while boys were instructed how to hunt while skiing and to work with wood or metal. The games they played were designed to prepare them for adulthood. A favorite exercise of boys was jumping while carrying weight and swimming while armed. A fully grown Viking was expected to be able to swim for several miles. Order in society was kept through harsh punishments. Men caught in adultery were hung or trampled by a horse. Arsonists were burned at the stake, and according to the Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, those who killed their brothers were hung by their heels next to a live wolf. Rebels who flouted the community's, or later the king's, decisions were tied to horses and torn apart, or bound to an enraged bull. Surprisingly for such violent times, the Vikings also believed that a cultured man should be musical. A popular saga told of the Norwegian king Godmund, who employed a musician that played with such vigor that even the knives and dishes started to dance. Indeed, no Viking court was complete without its poets, musicians, and dancers. The 13th century Orkneyinga saga tells of Ragnvald Kali Kolsson, a political mover who counted the king of Norway among his friends, who listed harp playing among the skills he was most proud of. Viking celebrations were probably rowdier than elsewhere in Europe. Feasts could last for quite a while. The Danish king Sven Estridsson held one for 8 days, and always involved drinking. The appropriate form at these celebrations was to imbibe without inhibition, and contests were frequent, usually battles of wit, where both sides tried not to show any effects of the alcohol. This was made more difficult since it was considered a grave breach of hospitality to refuse an offered horn of ale or mead unless you were old or sick. Feasting and hospitality were important because for nearly 6 months a year the Vikings had to endure freezing, snowy winters on land and foul storms at sea. The imposing landscape and harsh conditions produced a population that was brutally capable and independent. They valued courage and despised weakness. The custom, at least among those Swedes who went east, was for a father to place a sword in his newborn son's crib and say, "I shall not leave you property to inherit. You have nothing but what you can acquire for yourself with this sword." This attitude that life, glory, and wealth must be seized characterized the Norse throughout the Viking Age. When asked what faith he subscribed to, one 10th century Viking responded, "I believe in my own strength." Although they had gods, the Vikings had no word for religion. There was no official way to worship, no universal doctrine, and no central church. Instead, they had a set of general beliefs with extensive local variations. They saw the universe as one of concentric circles. There were 9 worlds, most of them invisible, in 3 distinct realms. The outer one, Utgard, was populated by giants and monsters who circled like wolves in the darkness, held back only by the watchful eyes of the gods. The middle circle was Midgard, literally middle yard, where humans and gods lived. The former shared the land with dwarves and dark elves, who were capable of producing magical gifts but guarded their hoards jealously. Across the Bifrost, a rainbow bridge that no human could cross, the 2 tribes of gods, Aesir and Vanir, lived in fabled Asgard, the Hall of the Slain, where the dead heroes feasted, waiting for the last great battle. The highest honor a warrior could receive was to be chosen as one of that number. The brave who fell in battle were scooped up by the Valkyries, shield maidens of Odin, whose job it was to fill his feasting hall of Valhalla before the end of days. The innermost circle was Nivelheim, the world of the dead. There, in a colorless twilight watched over by the goddess Hel, were the souls of the men, women, and children who had died. This grim place was not a punishment for the wicked. Rather, it was the fate of most humans. The exceptions were the brave who went to live with the Aesir, and the outcasts, those guilty of adultery, murder, and oath-breaking, who were doomed to become evil spirits haunting their barrows. Connecting the three main worlds was an immense ash tree called Yggdrasil. At its roots sat the Norns, three spirits, prophecy, being, and necessity, spinning out the fates of gods, giants, and men. Their task was to guard the tree from the Nidhogg, a great dragon, who feasted on the corpses of the wicked and chewed on the roots of the tree. Of the 13 major gods of Valhalla, Odin and Thor were the most important, but there was no agreement as to who was more powerful. The upper classes, especially those in Denmark and southern Sweden, tended to worship Odin, while farmers preferred Thor. Odin, the All-Father, was the god of poetry, madness, battle, and magic, who could grant men courage or deprive them of their wits. By hanging himself from a sacred tree for 9 days, he had learned the secret runes, which allowed him to see the future, and more than the rest of the gods he pursued wisdom. He had sacrificed an eye for a drink out of the well of knowledge, and had 2 pet ravens, Hugin and Munin, who circled the globe each day, returning to whisper their discovered secrets into Odin's ear. He was a formidable god in battle. His magical spear, Gungnir, never missed its target, and his 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, could speed across air, water, or land equally well, but he usually depended on his wisdom to win battles. Thor, by contrast, was a slow-witted god who depended on brute force to overwhelm his enemies. A red-haired deity with frightening eyes, he wielded the mighty hammer Mjolnir, which could level mountains or resurrect the dead. He served as mankind's protector, constantly fighting the ice giants who threatened to overwhelm Midgard. Where Thor walked, or flew in a chariot pulled by 2 magical goats, storms followed, and his battles could be seen in the flashes of lightning in the mountains. Although he was always popular, particularly with those who ventured out onto the open ocean, Thor's popularity grew at the end of the Viking Age, probably because he was seen as the most able defender against encroaching Christianity. Viking beliefs about the future were not overly cheerful. In the long, icy dark of a northern winter, it must have been easy to believe that all warmth would eventually fail. The wolves could only be held at bay for so long. Even the Viking gods were not immortal. Ragnarok, the last battle, was coming when all of them, gods, heroes, Norns, and the great tree Yggdrasil, were doomed. The shadowy dragon, Nidhogg, would rise from his feast of corpses, unleashing a winter lasting 3 years. Brother would fight brother and plunge the world into chaos. The monstrous wolves chasing the sun and moon would catch them and snuff them out. The fire demons and ice giants would breach the walls of Asgard, and the dead in hell would break free, overwhelming the gods and heroes assembled to fight them. There was a glimmer of hope, however. 2 children each, from Odin and Thor, would survive the axe, wind, and wolf age and form a new earth. There may have been no escape from the icy cataclysm to come, but that didn't stop the Vikings from appealing to the gods for their aid, especially at sea. The Viking world, after all, was one of water as much as land. When game was scarce, gifts from the sea, seal, whale, and walrus meat, sustained them. Travel along Norway's dramatic fjords, Sweden's coasts, and Denmark's islands could only be made by sea. In many ways, the ocean knit the Scandinavian world together, and as a result the Vikings viewed their world through the prism of the ocean. They called the spine of mountains that split their great peninsula Kjölen, the Keel, as if Scandinavia itself were an upturned boat. Babies were laid in cradles shaped like ships, children played with toy boats, and adults designed houses like ships, at times from discarded bits of ships. Women wore clasps and brooches in their shape, and some men even rode with stirrups fashioned with dragon-headed prows. Even in death, they refused to be parted from their ships. Great men and women merited fully fitted ornamental vessels, complete with slaughtered animals, weapons, wealth, and slaves, voluntary or not, all interred beneath a great mound. Lesser warriors were laid in simple ships, functional vehicles, to carry them into eternity. Those too poor to afford the real thing were buried in pits, covered in stones arranged in the shape of a boat. Thanks to this emphasis on the sea, the Vikings were well aware of the world to their south. Scandinavia had vast natural resources, including pelts, high-quality amber, and enormous iron deposits, and by the 9th century the northerners had been carrying out a brisk trade with the lands to their south and east for centuries. The word Scandinavia was in fact coined by Roman geographer Pliny the Elder in the 1st century A.D. He mistook the southernmost tip of Sweden for an island and called it Scania, after a tribe that lived there. His contemporary, Tacitus, writing at the end of the century, described its inhabitants with the word Sweons, from which we get Swedes, as well-armed, acquisitive, skilled in sailing curious ships with a prow at each end. In those first centuries of contact with the Romans, the strange ships came to trade, not rob. Their wares, especially the fine horses and black fox skins, were highly valued in Roman markets. The reverse was also true. Roman goods, most often weapons, glass, and jewelry, filtered up through Germanic intermediaries and are sometimes still found in early Scandinavian grave mounds. This trade also brought with it knowledge of the Latin and Greek alphabet, which, slightly adapted for carving on hard surfaces, formed the basis of the first runic script. When they did interact directly, the Romans learned to respect northern prowess. Writing from Constantinople in the 6th century, the historian Jordans described the Scandinavians as ferocious opponents who were of extraordinary stature. In part this was attributed to their harsh climate, which, he informed his readers, was one of perpetual darkness during the winter and unbroken light during the summer. This made it necessary for the inhabitants to live off birds' eggs and the flesh of animals, since wheat could not grow in the extreme north. The frozen landscape was a mass of shifting tribes, uncivilized by a single guiding hand like that of the Roman emperor. Jordans mentions more than 30 different nations within what is now modern Norway and Sweden, and tells how one in particular, the Goths, entered the Roman Empire. This first Viking invasion came by land and took several centuries. The Goths migrated from southern Sweden to the Black Sea, crossing into Roman territory in the 3rd century. They secured a great victory in 378, killing the Emperor Valens in the Balkans at Adrianople, and within 150 years had conquered Italy, southern France, and most of Spain. Procopius, the historian who chronicled the Roman recovery of much of these lands, described the northern tribes in a kind of awe, calling them superior to all who dwelt about them. Further migrations followed in the Gothic wake. Angles, Jutes, and Saxons, tribes originating from Denmark and northern Germany, invaded Britain, and by the time Procopius wrote were well on the way to pushing the native inhabitants into Wales. This early period, known appropriately enough as the Age of Migrations, were movements largely by land, not water, and aside from the Goths didn't affect the majority of the population in Scandinavia. What made the great Viking raids possible was a revolution in shipbuilding at the end of the 8th century. The earliest Viking vessels were copied from Roman or Celtic designs and powered by oars instead of the usual paddles. Like all ships of the time, they were slow and prone to capsizing in rough seas, appropriate for short trips that hugged the shore. Sometime in the 8th century, however, the Vikings invented the keel. This simple addition is among the greatest of nautical breakthroughs. Not only did it stabilize the ship, making it ocean-worthy, but it provided a base to anchor the mast. A massive sail, some as large as 800 square feet, could now be added as the major source of propulsion. The impact was immediate and stunning. In a time when few Europeans ventured far from land, the Vikings crisscrossed the Atlantic with cargoes of timber, animals, and food, covering distances of nearly 4,000 miles. To aid steering on these long voyages, the Vikings used a special oar, which they called a styrboard, or steering board. In deference to the dominant hand of most sailors, it was placed on the right side of the ship, near the stern, to make the ship easier to control. From this, we get the nautical term starboard, which refers to the right side of a vessel. The opposite term also owes its existence, albeit more indirectly, to the Vikings. When ships reached the port, they would usually be docked on the left side to avoid damage to the steering oar. Over time, port was used as a shorthand for left. A number of different ships were developed: cargo vessels, ferries, and fishing boats, but the warships, or longships in particular, were a brilliant combination of strength, flexibility, and speed. Built to glide over the surface of the water, the longships could be made from local materials, without the specialized labor needed for Mediterranean vessels. The ships of the south were both costly and clunky, held together with multiple rivets and braces, and several decks. The Viking ships, by contrast, were clinker-built with overlapping planks of oak, always green instead of seasoned, for greater flexibility, which allowed them to bend with the waves. Viking ships were mostly undecked, unless made to stow cargo, which made the long Atlantic crossing a brutal affair. During rough seas, the waves would frequently break over the sides, and there was little protection against the lashing rain or sleet other than a simple tent pitched on the deck. But what they lacked in comforts, they more than made up for with lethal simplicity. Viking longships lacked the keels of the larger ocean-crossing ships, and their relatively shallow drafts allowed them to be beached virtually anywhere instead of just the deep-water ports required by other vessels. This made it possible for a longship to navigate up rivers, and some were light enough to be carried between river systems. The Viking poets called the longships steeds of the waves, but they were more like prowling wolves. The hapless victims of Viking attacks took to calling the northerners sea wolves, after the predators that roamed the darkness outside of human habitation. The longships could accommodate up to 100 men, but could be handled on the open sea by as few as 15. They were agile enough to slip past coastal defenses, roomy enough to store weeks of loot, sturdy enough to cross the stormy Atlantic, and light enough to be dragged between rivers. But the most frightening thing about them was their speed. They could average up to 4 knots and reach 8 to 10 if the winds or currents were with them. This ensured that the element of surprise would nearly always be with the Vikings. A fleet in Scandinavia could cover the 900 miles to the mouth of the Seine in 3 weeks, an average of over 40 miles per day. Under oar, they were nearly as fast. One Viking fleet rowed up the 150 miles of the Seine against the current and fending off 2 Frankish attacks to reach Paris in 3 days. The medieval armies they faced, assuming they had access to good Roman roads, could only average between 12 and 15 miles per day. Even elite cavalry forces pushing hard could only manage 20. It was this speed, the ability to move up to 5 times as fast as their enemies, that made Viking attacks so lethal. With shallow drafts that could pass under bridges or up shallow rivers, fierce dragon prows and brightly painted shields fitted onto the sides that glittered like scales, they must have been psychologically unnerving. In a single lightning attack, they could hit several towns and disappear before their opponents could even get an army into the field. Nor was there any hope for the victims of challenging Viking supremacy at sea. Between 800 and 1100, most major naval battles fought in the North Atlantic involved Vikings fighting each other. As the 9th century dawned, all the pieces of the Viking age were in place. The Scandinavians had an advantage at sea that was impossible to defend against, knowledge of the major trade routes, and an unsuspecting world in full view. The only thing that remained was to select a suitable target. Chapter 2. Charlemagne's Tears. Braver are many in word than in deed. The Saga of Grettir the Strong. Legend has it that in the late 8th century, Charlemagne once caught sight of some Viking ships from his breakfast table while he was visiting the French coast. His hosts assumed that they were merchants, but the emperor knew better and warned that they were full of fierce foes. The Franks rushed to the shore with swords drawn, but the Vikings fled so quickly that it seemed as if they had simply vanished. The disappointed courtiers returned to the palace, where they were greeted with an astonishing sight. The great Charlemagne, Roman emperor and restorer of world order, was weeping. No one dared to interrupt him, but after a time spent gazing out to sea, he explained himself. "Do you know why I weep so bitterly, my true servants? I have no fear of those worthless rascals doing any harm to me. But I am sad at heart to think that even during my lifetime they have dared to touch this shore, and I am torn by a great sorrow, because I foresee what evil things they will do to my descendants and their subjects." Although this account is obviously apocryphal, Charlemagne hardly needed any prophetic gifts to foresee the danger the Vikings posed to his kingdom. He had, in fact, been preparing his defenses against them for years, and, ironically, was at least indirectly responsible for drawing the raiders' attention in the first place. Frankish contact with Scandinavia predated him by a century or more. Viking furs, amber, eiderdown, and whetstones were highly prized in Frankish markets, and Danish merchants were common in the great imperial trading centers of Dorstad on the Rhine and Quentovic near Bologna. With Charlemagne, however, the dynamic changed. Before him, the Franks had maintained a powerful and stable kingdom in what is today western Germany and eastern France. When Charlemagne accepted the Frankish crown in 768, he immediately began expanding his frontiers in all directions. By 800, he had seized part of the Pyrenees, Bavaria, and most of northern Italy, hammering together a larger state than any seen since the time of the Caesars. On Christmas Day that year, in a carefully orchestrated move, Pope Leo III placed a crown on Charlemagne's head and named him the new Western Roman Emperor, an office that had been vacant for more than 3 centuries. Roman-style coins were minted, imperial palaces were built, and Charlemagne even considered marrying the Byzantine empress and making the northern Mediterranean a Roman lake once again. A new Pax Francia seemed to be dawning under the auspices of the all-powerful Charlemagne. Little seemed to be beyond his reach or ambition. The scholar Alcuin, who had written of the first Viking raid on Lindisfarne, hinted that the Frankish emperor even had the ability to bring back the boys, monks, who had been kidnapped by the raiders. The addition of an imperial title may have burnished the emperor's credentials, but it also alarmed everyone on his borders. The Frankish tendency towards expansion, mixed with Charlemagne's clear ability, was a dangerous combination. If a Frank is your friend, went a popular 8th century proverb, he's certainly not your neighbor. If they didn't think so before, by 804 the Danes would have agreed with this proverb. That year Charlemagne finally crushed the Saxons of northwestern Germany, concluding a war that had lasted for 3 decades. Franks and Danes were now neighbors, and the Scandinavians had reasons to believe that they were next on the menu. The immediate cause for alarm was Charlemagne's plans to build a fleet, something his powerful land empire had previously lacked. His stated goal was to deny Danish pirates access to the Elbe, the river protecting the empire's northeastern flank. He had already tried to address this issue by building 2 fortified bridges to make it easier to move troops across at will. The other great rivers of the empire received similar treatment. A movable bridge of pontoons, connected by anchors and ropes, guarded the Danube, the great eastern river that allowed access to the heart of imperial territory, and a canal was started between the Rhine and Danube to allow troops to move quickly to a threatened border. When the emperor announced the addition of a North Sea fleet, most inhabitants of the Danish peninsula correctly suspected that Charlemagne's real target was the Danish port of Hedeby, located just over the border on the Schlefjord. The town had become the great entrepot for Viking goods, and a rival for even the largest Frankish markets. The Danes had set up toll booths and a mint, the first in Scandinavia, and were doing a brisk business that had begun to cut into the older, more established imperial trading centers. The man responsible for Hedeby's growth was a Viking warlord named Godfred. Frankish chronicles called him a king, but he was less a ruler of Denmark than a ruler in Denmark. Many Danes may have recognized his authority, but there were rival figures with their own halls even in the Jutland Peninsula that makes up the bulk of modern Denmark. Godfred, in what would become true Viking fashion, increased the population of Hedeby by importing captured merchants from Frankish towns he raided. To defend it against Charlemagne, he began constructing the Dannevirke, a massive earthen wall topped by a wooden stockade that would eventually extend across the neck of the peninsula from the North Sea to the Baltic. Safe behind these ramparts, Godfred began to harass his powerful neighbor. He sacked several Frankish towns and forced one of Charlemagne's allies to switch their allegiance. In response, a small Frankish army marched north, and the Dannevirke was put to its first test. Godfred's soldiers held their ground, and Charlemagne, who was occupied with revolts elsewhere, decided to buy peace. The two sides agreed that the river Ida would form a permanent border, and an apparently chastened Godfred sent hostages to the imperial capital of Aachen as a sign of good faith. This, however, turned out to be a ruse. When Charlemagne left with his army for the campaigning season early the next year, Godfred led 200 longboats on a plundering raid of the Frisia, what is today the Netherlands coast. His price for leaving was 100 pounds of silver, collected from the beleaguered merchants and peasants, and whatever portable wealth his Vikings could stuff into their ships. As a final note of defiance, he announced that he was claiming the northern stretch of the Frisian coast for himself. Despite the huge number of ships involved, the raid itself was relatively minor, and Charlemagne was too experienced to believe that any of his borders were permanent. The treaty would have been violated eventually. What really stung Charlemagne was the appropriation of a part of his empire. It wasn't immediately apparent how he should respond. The few ships he had were woefully inadequate for an attack, so naval operations were out of the question, and a land invasion carried its own risks. Charlemagne had just finished a bruising 30-year war with the Saxons, and, now in his late 60s, had no desire to get bogged down in another slow-burning war. The first order of business, in any case, was to contain Godfred. The coast had to be protected, and since the Franks lacked a true fleet, the Vikings themselves would have to provide one. Independent groups of Danes had been raiding the Frankish coast for more than a decade, and the larger ones were more than happy to take Charlemagne's gold in exchange for the promise of protection. While they protected him from the sea, Charlemagne gathered his army to storm the Dannevirke. The expedition never left. That summer, as the final preparations were being made, Godfred was cut down by one of his own men. In the chaos that followed, the identity of the killer was obscured. Some later claimed that it was his disgruntled son, angry that Godfred had recently married another woman, and others that the assassin was the king's housecarl. But either way, the threat vanished. Charlemagne was apparently annoyed to be cheated of his revenge. His biographer, Einhard, claimed that the emperor remarked, "Woe is me that I was not thought worthy to see my Christian hands dabbling in the blood of those dog-headed fiends." As it turned out, Charlemagne never got the chance to wash his hands in northern gore. He expired 4 years later, and was succeeded by his son Louis. Without a strong hand at the helm, Charlemagne's empire began to fall apart. At first the decay was barely noticeable. His son Louis seemed to be a younger, more cultured version of Charlemagne. The court took to calling him Louis the Debonair, both for his refined court and his continued patronage of the arts. Even on the battlefield, he appeared to live up to his famous predecessor. During his father's reign, he had been entrusted with the security of the southwest frontier and had been vigorous in its defense. He imposed Frankish authority over Pamplona and the Basques of the southern Pyrenees, and sacked Muslim-controlled Barcelona. All threats to his authority were ruthlessly suppressed, especially if they came from his own family. At his coronation, he forced all his unmarried sisters into convents to avoid potential threats from brothers-in-law. The promising new reign took an unexpected turn in 817, when Louis suffered a near-fatal accident. A wooden gallery connecting Aachen's cathedral to the imperial palace collapsed while he was crossing it after a church service, leaving many courtiers maimed or dead. Badly shaken, the injured Louis began plans for his succession, naming his eldest son Lothair as senior emperor and splitting the rest between two other sons and a nephew. The emperor recovered, but news of the planned partition had reached Italy, where his nephew Bernard, currently ruling as king, discovered that he was to be demoted to a vassal. He immediately revolted, but when Louis suddenly appeared in Burgundy with an army, the unprepared Bernard surrendered without a fight. He agreed to meet with his uncle to beg his pardon and hopefully retain Italy. Louis, however, was not in a particularly forgiving mood. Bernard was hauled back to Aachen and put on trial for treason, as an example to any other family members who were considering revolt. He was found guilty, stripped of his possessions, and sentenced to death. As a sign of his clemency, Louis commuted the penalty to blinding, and 2 days later the procedure was carried out. The soldiers tasked with performing the blinding weren't overly gentle. They used their heated iron rods so forcefully that Bernard didn't survive the ordeal, dying after 2 days in agony. Louis was never quite the same after the death of his nephew. Deeply religious to begin with, his guilt drove him to ever more lavish public displays. Members of the clergy became prominent advisors, and so many churches and monasteries were endowed that he acquired the sobriquet by which he is most known, Louis the Pious. When even this failed to alleviate the guilt, the emperor took the extraordinary step of staging a public confession of his sins before the Pope and the assembled ecclesiastics and nobles of the empire. As admirable as this conspicuous humility may have been, however, it had the effect of badly undercutting his own authority. Contemporary society was dripping with blood. The vast frontiers were surrounded by hostile peoples who could vanish into their forests or out to sea before the imperial army appeared. A good emperor was forced to set off on at least one large military campaign a year, and failure to do so would be interpreted as weakness. Where the emperor failed to show the mailed fist, violence flared up. Rebellions had to be met with brutal force. Captured enemies were routinely blinded, maimed, tortured, or hung. At Verdun, Charlemagne had beheaded 4,500 Saxon nobles as a punishment for revolt and relocated entire populations to pacify them. All of this was accepted as necessary behavior to impose order. When Louis, therefore, humbly bowed before the Pope and recited a laundry list of sins that included even minor offenses, it diminished the emperor in the eyes of both his subjects and his enemies. This was not the way an emperor was supposed to act. Charlemagne had wanted to bathe in the blood of his enemies. His son seemed to want to join a monastery. On the northern frontier, the Vikings were well aware of this situation. Charlemagne's defenses, particularly the fortified bridges and army, were still formidable enough to blunt a large attack, but there were ominous signs that the situation would soon change. A Frankish bishop traveling through Frisia found help from certain Northmen who knew the routes up the rivers that flowed toward the sea. The Vikings were clearly aware of both harbors and sea routes, and the empire lacked a fleet with which it could defend itself. The Franks, however, seemed oblivious to the danger. Life was more prosperous than it had been in many generations, and they were enjoying the benefits of imperial rule. The Archbishop of Sens, in northern France, confident in the protection of the emperor, had gone so far as to demolish the walls of his city to rebuild his church. The towns on the coast were equally vulnerable. A lively wine trade had developed along the Seine between Paris and the sea, and the coast of Frisia was dotted with ports. Thanks to the Franks' access to high-quality silver, a commodity largely absent in Scandinavia, coins had replaced bartering, and imperial markets were increasingly stockpiled with precious metals. The only thing preventing a major attack was the confusion of Louis's Viking enemies. The Danish peninsula had been in turmoil since the death of Godfred. A warrior named Harold Clack had seized power, but after a short reign had been expelled by the slain Godfred's son, Hárekr. Harold Clack appealed to Louis for help, slyly offering to convert to Christianity in exchange for aid. The emperor accepted, and in a sumptuous ceremony at the royal palace of Nivelheim, near Mainz, Harold and 400 of his followers were dipped in the baptismal font. Louis the Pious stood in as Harold's godfather. It was a triumphal moment for several reasons. Louis was clearly not the soldier his father was, but here was an opportunity to neutralize the Danes for the foreseeable future. If Harold could be installed on the Danish throne and then Christianize his subjects, it would pacify the northern border. The first part of the plan worked seamlessly. Harold was given land in Frisia and tasked with defending it against marauding Vikings, while an expedition to restore the throne was gathered. With a Frankish army at his back, he was able to force his rival, Hárekr, to recognize him as ruler. He then invited Louis to send a missionary to aid in the conversion of the Danes. The emperor chose a Saxon preacher named Ansgar, who immediately built a church in Hedeby. At this point, however, Louis's grand policy began to collapse. The Danes weren't particularly interested in Christianity, at least not as an exclusive religion. Nor, it seems, were they interested in Harold Clack. After a year, he was again driven into exile by his adversary Hárekr, a stout pagan. To add insult to injury, Harold returned to his Frisian lands and took up piracy, spending his remaining years plundering his godfather's property. With the expulsion of Harold Clack, a dam seemed to break in the north, and raiders began to spill out all over the Carolingian coast. Dorstad, the largest trading center in northern Europe and a main center of silver minting, was sacked every year from 834 to 837. Hárekr sent an embassy to Louis, claiming that he had nothing to do with the attacks on Dorstad, but did mention that he had apprehended and punished those responsible. The latter claim, at least, was probably true. Successful raiders were potential rivals, and Hárekr had no desire to repeat Harold Clack's fate. Individual Vikings out for plunder needed no invitations from the king to attack. The Frankish Empire was clearly tottering. Louis's tin-eared rule, exacerbated by an ill-thought-out plan to include a son from his second marriage into the succession, resulted in a series of civil wars and his deposition at the hands of his remaining sons. Although he was restored to the throne the following year, his prestige never recovered. The damage it did to his empire was immense. Not only were there lingering revolts, he spent the final years of his reign putting down insurrections, but the distractions allowed the Vikings to arrive in greater numbers. Multiple groups began to hit the coasts at the same time, burning villages, seizing booty, and carrying away the inhabitants, leaving only the old and sick behind. In 836, Hárekr himself led a major raid on Antwerp, and when several of his warriors died in the assault, he had the nerve to demand weregild, compensation for his loss of soldiers. Louis responded by gathering a large army, and the Vikings melted away, but only as far as Frisia, where they continued to raid. In 840, the emperor finally ordered the construction of his father's North Sea fleet to challenge them, but died a few months later without accomplishing anything. Instead of unifying against the common threat, Louis's sons spent the next 3 years fighting for supremacy as the empire disintegrated around them. On occasion, they even tried to use the Vikings to attack each other. The eldest sibling, Lothar, welcomed old Harold Clack into his court and rewarded him with land for raiding his brother's territory. This turned out to be an exceptionally bad idea, as it gave the Vikings familiarity with and access to Frankish territory. Harold and streams of like-minded Vikings happily plundered their way across the northern coasts of the empire. These attacks depended on speed, not overwhelming force. By the mid-9th century, the typical Viking army consisted of a few ships with perhaps 100 men. Some men would be left to guard the ships, while the rest fanned out to plunder. In these early days, they weren't interested in prisoners, and would kill or burn anything that couldn't be taken. The small numbers were a vulnerability, but this was made up for by the speed of the attacks. Most Vikings were reluctant to travel far from the coasts of the sea or river systems, and generally avoided pitched battles. Their equipment was more often than not inferior to their Frankish opponents. Vikings caught in open country were usually overwhelmed. This was partially because they lacked the armor common in Europe at the time. Frankish chronicles referred to them as naked, and they had to scavenge helmets and weapons from the dead, since several Frankish rulers sensibly forbade the sale of weapons to the Vikings on pain of death. The one exception to this general inferiority were Viking swords. The original design was probably copied from an 8th century Frankish source, a blacksmith named Ulfbert, whose name soon became a brand. The Vikings quickly learned to manufacture the blades themselves, and weapons bearing the inscription Ulfbert have been found all over Scandinavia. They were typically double-edged, with a rounded point, made of multiple bars of iron twisted together. This pattern welding created a relatively strong and lightweight blade that could be reforged if broken. They were clearly among a warrior's most prized possessions, and were passed down as heirlooms and given names like Odin's Flame and Legbiter. Aside from their swords, the Vikings' main advantages lay in their sophisticated intelligence gathering and their terrifying adaptability. They had advance warning of most Frankish military maneuvers and could respond quickly to take advantage of political changes. Most formidable of all was their malleability. Brotherhoods of dozens or even hundreds could combine into a larger army and then redissolve into groups at will. This made it almost impossible to inflict a serious defeat on them, or even predict where to concentrate your defenses. The Vikings were usually also more pragmatic than their opponents. They had no qualms about traveling through woods, used impromptu buildings like stone churches as forts, and dug concealed pits to disable pursuing cavalry. They attacked at night and were willing, unlike the Frankish nobility, to get their hands dirty by digging quick trenches and earthworks. Most of all, they could pick their prey and had exquisite timing. Earlier barbarians had avoided churches. The Vikings targeted them, usually during feast days when towns were full of wealthy potential hostages. The Christian communities didn't stand a chance. The monastery of Noirmoutier, on an island at the mouth of the Loire, was sacked every year from 819 to 836. It became an annual tradition for the monks to evacuate the island for the spring and summer, returning only after the raiding season had ended. Finally, in 836, they had enough, and carrying the relics of their patron saint and what was left of the treasury, they fled east in search of a safe haven. For the next 3 decades, they were driven from one refuge to the next, until they finally settled in Burgundy, near the Swiss border, about as far from the Vikings and the sea as one could get. A monk of Noirmoutier summed up the desperation in a plea for his fellow Christians to stop their infighting and defend themselves. The number of ships grows larger and larger. The great host of Northmen continually increases. They capture every city they pass through, and none can withstand them. There is hardly a single place, hardly a monastery, which is respected. All the inhabitants take to flight, and few and far between are those who dare to say, "Stay where you are, stay where you are, fight back, do battle for your country, for your children, for your family." In their paralysis, in the midst of their mutual rivalries, they buy back at the cost of tribute that which they should have defended, weapons in hand, and allowed the Christian kingdom to founder. The monk's advice went unheeded. By the time the Frankish Civil War ended, Charlemagne's empire had dissolved into 3 kingdoms, each with their vulnerabilities brutally exposed. The western Frankish kingdom became the basis of the Kingdom of France, the eastern, Germany, and the third, a thin strip of land between them called Lotharingia, was absorbed by its neighbors. Viking raiding groups became larger and bolder. Instead of 2 or 3 ships traveling together, they were now arriving in fleets of 10 or 12. More ominously still, they began to change their tactics. In 845, they returned to the island of Noirmoutier, but this time, instead of the usual raid, they fortified the island and made it a winter quarters. The usual practice was to raid in the warmer months and return home before the first snows fell. Now, however, they intended to stop wasting time in transit and to be more systematic in the collection of loot. Launching raids from their base, they could now penetrate further up rivers, putting more towns and even cities in range. Rouen, Nantes, and Hamburg were sacked, and Viking fleets plundered Burgundy. The next year they hit Utrecht and Antwerp, and went up the Rhine as far as Nijmegen. These raids all paled, however, before one that took place in 845 at the direction of the Danish king. He had not forgotten the Frankish support for his rival, Harold Clack. Now Horik finally had his revenge. Chapter 3. Pragnar Lothbrok. A cleaved head no longer plots. Edda of Saemund the Wise. Ragnar Lothbrok was undoubtedly the most colorful member of Horik's court. His surname, Lothbrok, means hairy breeches, a reference to a curious pair of hide leggings that he wore into battle, and which, he claimed, offered him some sort of magical protection. According to one legend, he made them to win his first wife, who was being held prisoner by a dragon-like serpent. To save himself from its venomous bite, he boiled a pair of leather pants in pitch and rolled them in sand. This unorthodox garment protected him long enough to dispatch the beast and claim his bride. Ragnar's actual origins are unknown. He became the hero of so many later Viking sagas that his historical accomplishments have become obscured. Stories were told to fill in the gaps, most of them charming, and almost all certainly false. His second wife, Aslaug, a woman so beautiful that bakers would let their bread burn while staring at her, was, according to these stories, his equal in cunning. Ragnar, still grieving the death of his first wife, agreed to marry her if she could visit him neither dressed nor undressed, neither fasting nor satisfied, and neither in company nor alone. She won his heart by appearing naked, but covered by her long hair, having eaten an onion the previous night, and with a sheepdog for company. These stories would undoubtedly have pleased Ragnar. He claimed to be a direct descendant of the god Odin, which, since Horik claimed the same, was an oblique way of asserting his fitness for the throne. Rule in the Viking world, however, was a question of prowess more than ancestry, so in 845 Ragnar led a force of Vikings in an attack on Paris. Ragnar was not a simple pirate. He was one of the first sea kings, a Viking who gained enough wealth and power through raiding to be recognized as a virtual king. A measure of the respect in which he was held was the size of his force. In a time when armies were numbered in hundreds of men, Ragnar commanded over 5,000 warriors and a fleet of 120 longships. Sailing south from Denmark, it took the sea wolves just over a week to reach the Seine River estuary. From there they rowed upstream and pillaged Rouen and Caroline, modern Chaussy, roughly 9 miles from the wealthy Abbey of Saint-Denis. His men helped themselves to whatever riches they could find and systematically plundered the fertile districts within easy reach of the river. Rumors of each fresh attack panicked the locals, and they and the monks of Saint-Denis fled, carrying their relics and valuables with them. However, they were met by the Frankish king Charles the Bald, who tried to stem the flood of refugees by ordering them back to their homes and churches. He had raised an army to confront the raiders and advanced cautiously. Ragnar presented the king with a difficult choice. The Viking was well known for his blitzkrieg-like tactics to keep his enemies off balance, and only fought when the odds favored him. If Charles approached on one bank of the river, Ragnar and his men could just slip to the other side and avoid a battle. Since he wanted to force a showdown, the king split his forces and advanced along both banks. Unfortunately for the Franks, Charles' army was not the premier fighting force it had been in Charlemagne's day. Standards had fallen to such a degree that it now regularly fell into confusion and was well known for its carelessness and inefficiency. Ragnar attacked the smaller section of the Frankish forces with his entire army, easily slaughtering it as the horrified Charles watched impotently from the other side of the river. Worse was to come. The captured Frankish soldiers, 111 of them, were transported to an island in the Seine and hung in full view of Charles' army as a sacrifice to Odin. This was equal part religious observation and equal part calculated strategy of psychological terror. To modern eyes, the Vikings appear appallingly brutal, but there were limits to their violence. They seldom willingly destroyed harvests, and despite routine plundering, never disturbed the vineyards of Aquitaine. There was much more money to be had in extortion. As far as the execution of prisoners, Charlemagne had done far worse with his Saxon captives at Verdun, where he had beheaded 4,500 of them as punishment for a revolt. Ragnar's display had the desired effect. The Franks were unnerved and easily routed when Ragnar charged at them. Charles was forced to withdraw with what was left of his army to the Abbey of Saint-Denis, which he vowed to defend at all costs. The presence of an army at his rear would normally have been worrying, but Ragnar had measured its quality and tellingly saw no reason to delay his approach to the now relatively undefended Paris. In many ways, medieval Paris was the ideal Viking target. Not only was it rich, but it was largely confined to the Ile de la Cité, an island in the middle of the Seine. The first sight of the city, however, must have been momentarily disappointing. Despite Ragnar's strategy of attacking on a holy day when churches would be full of potential victims, news of their approach had preceded his army, and most of the population had already fled. The Vikings flooded in, spreading out through the streets in search of plunder. They had been raiding Europe for the better part of 5 decades, but never had they looted such a prize. Thanks to advance warning, which enabled the monks to remove most of the valuables, the Abbey of Saint-Germain managed to escape most of the destruction. When they returned 6 weeks later, they found several of the outbuildings burned and superficial damage to the Abbey church. The only real casualty was the wine cellar, which the Vikings had managed to break into and empty. The city itself proved to be as frustrating for the Vikings as the Abbey of Saint-Germain. Much of the expected treasure had been carried away into the surrounding countryside by the frightened inhabitants. They could send out raiding parties in search of it, but that opened them to the possibility of ambush or an assault by Charles' army. In fact, every moment Ragnar spent in Paris, his situation worsened. The Frankish king had been collecting reinforcements and was now at the head of a considerable army in a position to block the Viking escape. Even more worrying was the fact that the Vikings were beginning to show signs of dysentery, which further reduced their fighting ability. From the deserted monastery of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, Ragnar reached out to Charles, hinting that he was willing to leave if offered a suitable tribute. The Frankish king was in the mood to negotiate. Despite the size of his army, he had no confidence in its quality or in the loyalty of its commanders. He also had the headache of rebellious vassals, ambitious family members, and chronic revolts. Ambassadors for both sides met in the monastery of Saint-Denis, and the Franks offered extraordinary terms. Not only could the Vikings keep their plunder and depart unmolested, but they would be paid nearly 6,000 pounds of gold and silver for their trouble. This is the first recorded example of what the English called Danegeld, literally Danish money, a series of increasingly ineffective bribes by desperate monarchs to get the Vikings to go away. Most of the money to pay for it would be commandeered from the church and then later from the people by means of a special tax. The very people who were bearing the brunt of the Viking attacks were now called upon to pay their tormentors bribes. To add insult to injury, the Danegeld tended to increase, rather than prevent, Viking raids, since the offer of protection money simply attracted other Vikings. No matter how expedient his reasons, Charles was unwisely trusting gold to do the work of steel. The only silver lining for the Parisians, although it must not have seemed so at the time, was that it took Charles nearly 2 months to raise the necessary money. During that time, dysentery took a serious toll on Ragnar's army. So many Vikings died that the Parisians viewed it as a miracle, claiming that Saint-Germain was belatedly punishing the Norsemen for defiling his abbey. As soon as Ragnar was paid, the spoils were loaded onto the ships, along with a heavy iron bar from the city gate to prove that he had taken the city. He proceeded in easy stages down the Seine, taking the time to plunder the trading and fishing ports along the coastline. He and his men arrived in Denmark fantastically wealthy, and with reputations to match. Ragnar himself presented the loot to King Horik, boasting about how easy it was to obtain. The only resistance he met, he reportedly said, was from the long-dead Saint-Germain. The implication was clear. The days of Charlemagne were gone. There was nothing now to fear from the Franks. Ragnar may have been right about Charles the Bald, but not every Frankish ruler was weak. Charles' powerful half-brother, Louis the German, the immediate southern neighbor of Horik, was not amused by Viking raids, and had immediately sent a delegation to the Danish king to demand the return of all Frankish goods. This was no idle request. A word from Louis would send an imperial army flooding into Denmark, in numbers and quality that Horik couldn't hope to resist. Embarrassingly for the Viking king, these East Frankish delegates had been present for Ragnar's little speech, and they made it clear that if Horik wanted to prevent a war, he would have to accept Louis the German as his overlord. Horik had no choice but to give in. As galling as it might have been for him to submit, there was at least one upside. He now had an official excuse to confiscate the spoils that had made Ragnar dangerously popular in Denmark. The Parisian loot was soon on its way to Louis the German, along with all of the Danes' Christian prisoners, and although Horik had no control over individual Viking raiders, most of Ragnar's men seemed to have left his territory, he did withdraw his official support for their attacks to mollify Louis the German. This submission seems to have been serious on Horik's part. Not only did he send regular gifts and embassies for the duration of his reign, but in a clever political move to get rid of potential rivals, he allegedly rounded up the few of Ragnar's men that had stayed in Denmark and had them executed. Ragnar himself seems to have survived the purge, although accounts differ as to what exactly happened to him. The Franks claimed that he died of dysentery, but this is probably wishful thinking, since he is mentioned by later English and Irish chroniclers as successfully raiding the shores of the Irish Sea, as well as northern Scotland and the Western Isles. His exile, whether self-imposed or as a result of official banishment, provided fodder for his myth to grow. A legendary warrior haunting the shores of the Atlantic seaboard like an early Francis Drake. His wealth must have been the stuff of Viking dreams. In the 12th century, an inscription to him was carved into the wall of an ancient tomb in the Orkneys, an archipelago in northern Scotland, by a traveling scholar. This mound was raised before Ragnar Lothbrok's tomb. His sons were brave, smooth-hide men though they were. It was long ago that a great treasure was hidden here. Happy is he that might find it. That reference to his sons, 4 boys who had followed in their father's footsteps, did not seem to have brought Ragnar much comfort. According to a 13th century Icelandic saga, he admitted that his desire for fame and fortune was partly out of fear that his sons, especially his oldest, Ivar the Boneless, would eclipse him. Perhaps it was this that drove him relentlessly on. In any event, the family was soon allowed to return to Denmark. In 854, Horik and most of the royal household were slaughtered by a disgruntled nephew, and the exiles were welcomed home. Ragnar may or may not have made the trip. His end is as obscure as his beginning. Almost all the stories, however, agree that he died as a proper Viking should, while raiding. Several stories are told of his demise, from being killed by a botched attack on the Isle of Anglesey to dying in turf war with other Vikings off the coast of Ireland. The most famous story, however, is that he was shipwrecked off the English coast in a freak storm. The Anglian king Aelle of Northumbria, whose lands had been a favorite target of Viking raids, overwhelmed the survivors as they scrambled up the beach and seized Ragnar. Relishing the opportunity to dispatch his tormentor, the king came up with a unique form of execution. Ragnar was thrown into a pit of vipers and left to die. When his famous breeches protected him from the bites, Aelle hauled him out, had him stripped, and threw him back in again. The old fox, now lying naked and mortally wounded, looked up at Aelle unbowed and sang a Viking battle hymn. "It gladdens me to know that Odin makes ready the benches for a banquet. Soon we shall be drinking ale from the curved horns. The champion who comes into Valhalla does not lament his death. I shall not enter his hall with words of fear upon my lips. The Aesir will welcome me. Death comes without lamenting. Eager am I to depart. The Valkyries summon me home. I laugh as I die." The 13th century Icelandic saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. His final words, gasped out as he was dying, were a warning to Aelle. "When the boar bleats, the piglets come." The story is undoubtedly apocryphal, but it is true in at least one respect. Lindisfarne and Iona had only been a taste of the Viking storm that was about to break on England. When Ragnar's son, Björn Ironside, heard of his father's death, he supposedly gripped his spear so tightly that it left an impression in the wood. His younger brother, Halfdan, crushed a chess piece so forcefully that it made his fingers bleed. If the Northumbrian king did indeed kill Ragnar, then hopefully he enjoyed his triumph while it lasted. The piglets were on their way. Chapter 4. Thorgils the Devil. The sea spewed forth floods of foreigners over Ireland, so that no haven, no landing place, no stronghold, no fort, no castle might be found, but it was submerged by waves of Vikings and pirates. The 9th century Irish Chronicle, Annals of Ulster. The great Viking invasion of England originated at least partially in Ireland. Men of Horik and Ragnar's generation had looked to the Frankish kingdoms for their raids, but their children began to look for greener pastures to the west. It wasn't that the Franks were getting any better at defending themselves, rather the seemingly inexhaustible supply of Frankish gold was starting to dry up. Within 15 years of Ragnar's raid on Paris, all the main rivers of western Francia had been visited by Viking raiders. At first, they had conducted smash-and-grab maneuvers, seizing whatever communion vessels or reliquaries were on hand. Quickly, however, they had realized that there was more money to be had in extortion. The abbot of Saint-Denis, for example, was ransomed for 686 pounds of gold and 3,000 pounds of silver. Quite a nice haul for a single prisoner. Others found windfalls in mercenary activity. When some Vikings began raiding on the Seine, a Norseman named Wayland offered to drive them off in exchange for 2,000 pounds of silver and some livestock. Charles the Bald accepted, but took such a long time raising the funds that Wayland upped his price to 5,000 pounds. After it had been paid, he dutifully confronted the Seine raiders, but instead of attacking, he agreed to let them depart in peace for 6,000 pounds of silver. Without unsheathing a sword, Wayland had made himself a wealthy man. By the end of the century, more than 40,000 pounds of silver had been poured into Viking pockets, and Frankish kings were starting to debase their coinage. The coasts were beginning to be deserted as populations moved inland, and some religious communities were seeking refuge in more protected areas. Even worse, from the Viking perspective, was the fact that local resistance was beginning to stiffen. To his credit, Charles the Bald had finally applied himself. His two main palaces were in northern France, near Picardy, and he began a systematic campaign to defend them. Fortified bridges were built across the Seine and the Loire, drastically diminishing the Vikings' ability to strike. The bridges acted as choke points on the river. They could be easily defended and prevented the Viking ships from moving further up rivers. The only way past them was to take them by siege, something which the typical lightly armed Viking raider was not equipped to do. Castles were built near the most threatened areas. These precautions didn't stop the attacks, but they succeeded in turning the tide, and the Vikings, faced with diminishing returns, began to look for easier targets. In the years after Lindisfarne, most Viking attention had been directed toward the Frankish Empire, but now it shifted back to the British Isles. While not as wealthy as the Frankish kingdoms, England, Scotland, and Ireland were politically divided and well stocked with monasteries. Ireland in particular, with its abundance of monastic houses, was a tempting target. The island was overflowing with precious materials that had been exported to most of northern Europe. It had rich deposits of gold, silver, and copper, as well as emeralds, sapphires, amethysts, topaz, and freshwater pearls. High-quality metalwork had been produced by Irish craftsmen since at least 2000 BC, and Kerry diamonds, glittering stones that could be found along the rocks of the coast, were used to adorn reliquaries, jewelry, and even book covers. This native prosperity, coupled with Gaelic religious devotion, had produced a great cultural flowering. Ireland was in its golden age. Irish monasteries were bright centers of learning in an otherwise darkening Europe, producing gorgeous illuminated manuscripts and brilliant scholars who exported Irish learning to all corners of Western Europe. Politically, the island was slowly drifting towards a kind of unity as well. Tribal warfare was vicious, but over time a number of petty kingdoms had formed. These were loosely formed into two main confederations. The sub-kings of the north looked to the king of Tara, while those of the south were dominated by the kings of Munster. Traditionally, Tara was the more powerful of the two, and occasionally its sovereign was recognized as Ardri, or High King. This proto-unity, however, failed to prepare it for the Viking onslaught because there were severe deficiencies when it came to defense. Most of the petty kings only paid lip service to their superior, and even under a strong High King, the army was essentially uncontrollable. Any force that was fielded consisted of a number of tribes, each commanded by its own chief and acting as an independent unit rather than a cohesive whole. However brave or skilled individual soldiers might be, such an army was unreliable against a more disciplined opponent. Even if it could win a victory, it would be unable to exploit it. While the Danes were busy pulling apart Charlemagne's empire, their Norwegian cousins rounded northern Scotland and hit Ireland. Just 2 years after the Lindisfarne raid, they sacked the great island monastery of St. Columba on the northwestern coast of Scotland. The communities of Skye and Kells, 40 miles north of Dublin, were plundered in quick succession. The monks were slaughtered, the buildings were burnt, and most of the livestock was carried away. Within a decade, the Vikings had rounded the northern headlands and begun plundering their way down the west coast bays. These early raids, like their counterparts in England and the Carolingian Empire, were usually small, no more than 2 or 3 ships, testing the resistance of the locals. They followed the by now familiar practice of favoring victims who were isolated and within easy reach of the sea. Even the most famous of Irish monasteries could be raided and left before any local fighting men showed up. The success of the raids drew increasing numbers of Vikings, and the next 2 decades saw a glut of assaults that sent the brilliant Irish Renaissance up in flames. Even remote Skellig Michael, a seemingly impregnable monastery 8 miles off the southwestern Irish coast and 500 feet above sea level, was vulnerable. In 821, a group of Vikings managed to scale its craggy face, sack the gold-rich cloister, and kidnap the abbot. Although this particular group of Vikings amused themselves by starving the holy man to death, others began to copy the Danes and look for ransoms. This extended to non-human objects as well. The first raiders had been drawn primarily to the gold and silver-encrusted cases created for holy objects. The things they contained were of no use. Relics were tossed aside, and the jeweled covers of books were pried off. The mutilated manuscripts were then tossed into fires, discarded in the mud, or dumped into the sea. Gradually, however, the Vikings realized that the Irish cared more for the relics and gospels than their coverings, and that they were willing to pay exorbitant sums to retrieve them. Even more valuable were the Irish themselves. Those who were not important enough to be ransomed could be sold as slaves in Baltic or Islamic markets. Viking ships now began targeting human quarry. When the village of Hoth at the head of Dublin Bay was attacked, the Vikings specifically targeted women, dragging off a large number to their ships. Attacks on Kildare brought in 280 captives, while Armagh yielded 1,000. The psychological impact of these new tactics so thoroughly unnerved Irish monks that they began to pray for bad weather. In the margins of a commentary on Latin grammar, a 9th-century monk in the Irish monastery of St. Gall wrote, "The wind is fierce tonight. It tosses the sea's white hair. I fear no wild Vikings crossing the main." As miles of undefended coastline were plundered, rumors of richer prices further inland began to reach Viking ears, and their raids became more daring. In 828, they reached Ireland's east coast, venturing up the Boyne River into Louth, where they captured a local king. Not all of these raids were successful. While exploring the west coast, the crew of one ship was massacred, and another was driven off by angry monks. But instead of winning the beleaguered defenders a respite, these failed attempts were always followed by attacks in greater numbers. When the monks of one monastery sent troops to defend their property, it merely alerted the Vikings to the presence of treasure. The next year saw 3 raids in a single month, all of which were successful. Attacks began to shift from sporadic, unorganized hits on the monasteries of the coast to large-scale, efficient penetrations up rivers to inland targets. On Christmas Eve of 836, a group of daring Vikings traveled more than 20 miles inland through the difficult terrain of the Avonmore Valley to sack the central monasteries of Glendalough and Clonmore. That same night, 160 miles away in the northeast, another party of Vikings hit Connacht, seizing the monastery's most valuable relics, which had been brought out for High Mass. That year also saw the appearance of Thorgils, the most notorious of all Viking raiders. The Irish called him Turgis, the Gaelic form of his name, and he arrived with so many ships that Irish chroniclers referred to them as a royal fleet. He seems to have had dynastic connections in Scandinavia and was accepted as the leader of all the Vikings in Ireland. In 839, he set his sights on the island's holiest shrine. The Irish version of Jerusalem was Armagh in Northern Ireland. St. Patrick himself had chosen it as the spiritual center of Gaelic Christianity, had been appointed as its first bishop, and had died and was buried there. Many of his personal effects were kept as relics, and over the years the area around his tomb had developed into a massive complex of schools, monasteries, and a cathedral. Thorgils personally led the attack, slaughtering the monks and students who had been unable to escape in time. The altars were shattered, the tombs and reliquaries were hacked open, and the relics torn apart in the search for valuables. As an encore, Thorgils smashed his way into St. Patrick's Cathedral and conducted a sacrifice to Odin on what was left of the high altar. The outrage ensured that the Viking Sea King became the most despised figure in Ireland. To the Irish, he was a cruel and monstrous servant of Satan, a blasphemous tormentor who must be stopped at all costs. Thorgils, however, was unlike any other Viking that they had as yet faced. He had greater plans than simply grabbing loot. He anointed himself king of all foreigners in Erin, and it seems that he aimed at the outright conquest of the entire island. His timing couldn't have been better. The sub-king of Munster had attempted to claim the high kingship, but had only succeeded in plunging central Ireland into chaos. By capturing Armagh, Thorgils had found the resources necessary to make a sustained push into the interior. Instead of simply plundering the monastery, however, he set himself up as its new master and started collecting the customary duties. The holiest site in Ireland, to all intents and purposes, now had a pagan abbot. Viking fleets were sent up rivers and along the shoreline to weaken resistance. So many of his ships prowled the coasts that monks began to complain that there was no place without a fleet of Vikings. While his forces were busy eroding the strength of the native Irish kings, Thorgils began looking for a more defensible location to base his operations. On the east coast of Ireland, in a sheltered bay of the Irish Sea, he built a long fort, a shore fortress, and spent the winter in Ireland. It was an ideal location, easily defended and offering immediate access to the sea. Located on a splendid natural harbor at a spot that offered a convenient fording place across the Liffey River, it lay within direct reach of both the interior of Ireland and the west coast of Britain. The local name for the spot was the Black Pools, Dubh Linn in Gaelic, and it stuck. Thorgils laid down heavy timbers for the streets and built houses in the Viking fashion with wickerwork and mud-daubed walls. Surrounding these was a thick earthen wall topped with a wooden palisade. Dublin was not meant to be a simple base of operations. It became the center of the first Viking state established in Western Europe, with Thorgils as its king. From these headquarters, Thorgils stepped up his attacks. In 844, he led 60 ships up the Shannon River to present-day Limerick. From there, he split up his forces to sack sacred sites throughout central and western Ireland. Thorgils himself burned the monastery of Clonfert and then attacked the abbey of Clonmacnoise, famous throughout Europe for its seminary. Here Thorgils seemed to have repeated his earlier behavior at Armagh. After killing the monks and looting the abbey, he brought his wife Oda into the main church. Wiping off the splattered gore, Thorgils helped Oda to climb on top of the shattered high altar. She was known as a Volva, or prophetess, and from her perch she amused the assembled Vikings by demonstrating her gift of prophecy in a ceremony to Odin. The ritual defilement of the two holiest places in Ireland was not a coincidence. Thorgils was asserting the supremacy of the Viking gods, and doing so in a manner which would have shaken the faith of the medieval Irish mind. A monk in the south lamented that many of the Irish forsook their Christian baptism and joined the fair foreigners in plundering churches. By the end of the decade, Ireland was in serious danger of being completely overrun. Its petty kings were too involved with their own feuds to unite, so clerics began to take the field. The abbot of Terryglass was killed leading the local militia, and the abbot of Armagh was captured together with the relics of St. Patrick. It seemed only a matter of time before the Vikings would have the entire island in their grip. It came as a profound relief, both spiritually and physically, therefore, that in 845 Thorgils was captured by the High King of Tara, Mael Shefflin. How the king managed to do this remains somewhat of a mystery. It's only recorded that Thorgils was seized through trickery and not battle. The hated Viking was tied up, weighed down with stones, and thrown into a river to drown. The death of Thorgils ended the Viking dream of ruling a united pagan Ireland, and it also shattered the Vikings themselves. The first raiders had been Norwegian, but now Danes were beginning to show up in increasing numbers, and tensions between the two groups had reached boiling point. The death of Thorgils removed the lone figure respected by both sides, and in 850 a Viking civil war broke out over the control of Dublin. The Irish were the main beneficiaries of the struggle between the Dubhgail, black foreigners, that is Danes, and the Fingal, white foreigners, that is Norwegians. In the first year of the war, a Danish force managed to batter its way over the walls and sack Dublin, but the Norwegians counterattacked, slaughtering the Danes in a bloody 3-day battle. Adding to the chaos was a third group, the offspring of mixed marriages between Irish and Vikings who were called Galgodel, or foreign Irish. The Galgodel fought for whichever side offered them a better deal, and most often as mercenaries for themselves. Gradually, the native Irish began to drive the distracted Vikings back to the coasts. The High King, Mull, crushed a Viking army attempting to enter his territory, leaving 700 dead on the field. The same year, one of the king's allies caught a raiding party of 200 and wiped them out. King Mull even reached out to Charles the Bald, seeking a military alliance against the Vikings. While the Vikings were entrenched enough to defend themselves against native assaults, Dublin was attacked 6 times, each with disastrous results for the Irish. The real threat to their security came from within. The leader of the Norwegians was Olaf the White, the son of a Norwegian warlord who had arrived in Dublin the year of Thorgil's death. The Danes, on the other hand, were led by his distant kinsman, Ivar the Boneless, eldest son of Ragnar Lothbrok. It's unclear when exactly Ivar reached Ireland, but the Danes rallied behind him. Of all of Ragnar's children, Ivar the Boneless was the most enigmatic. The Vikings themselves had contradictory legends about the meaning of his nickname. Some claimed that he was born completely without bones, but had supernatural strength and height. Others that his legs had only gristle, forcing him to be carried into battle on a shield. Since it's highly unlikely that the Vikings would have respected a handicapped person, or that he would have had such a long and successful career of raiding with such a disability, a more likely explanation is that he was double-jointed. Such flexibility would be useful on the battlefield, and given his family's connection with snakes, his brother was named Sigurd Snake in the Eye, it would have been an apt description. What all the sagas do agree on, however, is that Ivar was remarkably cunning. It is doubtful, Ragnar's saga claimed, if anyone has ever been wiser than he. His actions in Dublin seem to support this. Arriving in Dublin in force, he offered to split command of the city with his rival, rather than weaken both of them in a protracted struggle. Olaf agreed, and the two of them took the joint title of king. Neither Viking ruler was interested in pursuing Thorgil's old dream of conquering Ireland. It had become clear that much of Ireland was practically beyond the Viking reach. The bogs and forests of the interior were too treacherous for bands of Vikings to penetrate, and the past several decades had warned the Vikings from wandering too far from the coasts. There were, however, more tempting opportunities elsewhere. Since its founding around the year 841, Dublin had quickly prospered, becoming one of the busiest trading ports of the Viking world. Other Viking longforts in Limerick, Waterford, Wexford, and Cork were also flourishing, but none as quickly as Dublin. It was already connected to the main commercial centers in Norway, England, and the Frankish kingdoms, and was a regular port of call for Vikings raiding throughout the North Atlantic. Perhaps it was from these sources that knowledge of the rich kingdoms to the east first filtered through to Ivar. Or perhaps he really was out to satisfy a blood debt for the death of his father. Either way, in 865, Ivar the Boneless decided to invade England. Chapter 5. The Great Heathen Army. Pagans from the northern regions came like stinging hornets and spread on all sides like fearful wolves. Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Unlike its unfortunate neighbors to the south and west, England had hitherto largely escaped the attentions of Viking raiders in the 9th century. There had been sporadic raids since the attack on Lindisfarne, but these had been relatively small and limited operations. Most monasteries were on the alert, and when one was raided, the other communities would usually scatter, ruining the chances of the Vikings obtaining further loot. In 825, for example, word reached the monks of Iona that there were raiders in the area. Most of the community fled, carrying the relics of St. Columba and the other portable treasures with them. Only the abbot and a handful of monks stayed behind to tend to the priory church. A few days later the Vikings struck, bursting into the church in the middle of a mass. The monks were butchered immediately, but the abbot was kept alive and questioned as to where he had hidden the valuables. When he refused to divulge the secret, the Vikings hacked off his limbs on the steps of the high altar and left him to die. As brutal as these attacks were, however, they had been mercifully rare. This was at least in part due to the fact that the English were more politically organized than their Irish neighbors. Political organization, however, had not kept Charlemagne's empire safe, and it could only deter major Viking raids in Britain for so long. In the 1830s, the raids began to intensify. The first years of the decade saw Vikings off the Kentish coast, where they overran the island of Sheppey. For the next 15 years, the Vikings used this as a base to raid and interfere in English politics. When Cornwall revolted against the West Saxons, the Vikings assisted them, eroding the power of Wessex. The West Saxon king, Egbert, raised an army to confront them but was soundly defeated. After brushing aside another army of Wessex men, the Vikings ravaged East Anglia and Kent and sacked the city of Rochester. In 844, they extended their reach into Northumbria, restoring an ousted king by killing his rival. In 850, their tactics, as they had elsewhere, abruptly changed from seasonal raiding to outright conquest. That autumn, they seized the island of Thanet off the Kentish coast and wintered there. The presence of 350 ships at the mouth of the Thames so alarmed the West Saxon king Ethelwulf that he sent his son Alfred to Rome to petition God's support. Fortunately for Wessex, in the short term at least, the Vikings decided to target the other major state, Mercia, which had absorbed most of its smaller neighbor Essex. Several hundred of them stormed Canterbury and burned London, forcing the Mercian king, Beorhtwulf, to muster his army. Normally the Vikings avoided pitched battles, but this time they had the numbers to feel confident. After a brief struggle, the Mercian shield wall broke, and Beorhtwulf and his army fled. Instead of continuing deeper into Mercia, however, the Vikings crossed into Surrey to break the power of Wessex. Yet this time, instead of an overwhelming victory, they suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of King Ethelwulf and his sons. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle gushed that it was the greatest slaughter ever heard of. It must not have been too crushing, though, for the next year the Vikings tried again. This time they attacked the West Saxon capital of Winchester, but were again driven off. The campaign taught the Vikings several valuable lessons. The first was that there was much plunder to be had. London and Canterbury in particular had been rich targets, and there were sure to be more such cities further inland. Second, it also revealed the relative strengths of the four English kingdoms. A Viking force could stand against a royal army in the field and come out the victor. They had failed only because they had lacked a unified strategy, and had been severely outnumbered. Ivar's attempt would correct these mistakes. In 865, Ragnar's son launched the largest invasion of the British Isles in recorded history. He sailed from Dublin with two of his brothers, Halfdan of the Wide Embrace and Ubba, as well as his colleague Olaf the White. Navigating their way along the southern coast, they landed in East Anglia without opposition. The locals immediately raised a sum of money to bribe them to go away, the first example of Danegeld in England. Ivar took their money, but had no intention of leaving. He had command of a force so massive that the English referred to it simply as the Great Heathen Army. Unlike previous Viking forces, this was not just a collection of war bands, but was under the unified command of a single leader and his ruthless lieutenants. It was highly mobile and could break into component parts and reform according to terrain or need. Tremendous planning had gone into the creation of the army. Men had been recruited from the Norwegian fjords, the Frisian Islands, the western Baltic, and Denmark. They were drawn both by the lure of wealth and now, for the first time, the possibility of acquiring land. Ivar seems to have intended to settle on English soil and to rule as a major king to rival the warlords in Scandinavia. His colleague, Olaf the White, would most likely return to Dublin once the fighting was done. In fact, Olaf quickly broke off from the main army and confined himself to the western Scottish and Welsh coasts. territory which could be safely controlled from Ireland. Ivar's plan was to pick off the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms one by one. His first order of business was to gather supplies for the coming campaigning season. In its entry for the year 865, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle compactly describes his success in intimidating the locals into giving him what he needed. A great heathen army came into England and took up winter quarters in East Anglia,